Buffers, buffers, buffers. Who's got the buffers? Well, mostly everyone here. And not here. Never! You'll never make us use them! Well, what are buffers? Well, buffers are buffers. Okay, good video, good talk. All done. Okay, fine, I'll explain. Buffers are actually just a component of a specific kind of railroad coupler system, known as buffers and chain couplers. They were popularized in the UK, and spread to most places, so much so that plenty of countries still utilize buffers. The purpose of the buffers is simply to create a buffer in between rail cars, or locomotives for that matter, because, as it turns out, it's actually pretty bad to just let the rolling stock slam into each other without something in between the frames to keep, them from doing that particularly hard. The buffers create a buffer zone in between all the rolling stock to let them couple together in a much safer way. The buffers are designed to hit each other, and it prevents extra stresses on the rolling stock itself. Modern buffers will have some kind of shock-absorbing pads, which will often move and compress in order to absorb any kind of impact. The classic buffer is round, though more modern ones tend to be rectangular. The coupler in the middle of the buffers can vary a bit. The classic one is the chain, as I mentioned, but there are plenty of other kinds of couplers that can be used in association with buffers. And most of the time, there are two buffers on either side of the rolling stock. However, particularly on narrow gauge routes, sometimes they only use one in the center. And buffers, of course, have their own distinctive history. The earliest buffers, way a long time ago, were crafted out of wood and are now commonly referred to as dumb buffers because, well, they really were just wooden blocks. In effect, they were often shaped, but outside of that, they didn't even have any way of compressing. They were just stopgaps in between. The crudest way you could have done it, frankly. But by the 1830s, the first spring-loaded buffers were introduced. On the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, the spring-loaded buffers slowly became much more popular because they actually absorbed the impact rather than just putting a wooden block in the middle and calling it a day. And the technology remained pretty consistent overall, though some countries altered the shape of the buffer plates. In England, for example, they were the same shape pretty much on both sides. But that meant there was the occasional tendency for them to slide off of each other and actually get stuck or locked together. That can also happen on tight turns, and it can cause accidents. It's one of the flaws in the buffer system. German railway buffers are actually flat on one side and convex on the other, which means they fit together in such a way so they're less likely to slide off. Other kinds of buffers include the rod buffers, which is the earliest type of German sprung buffer. These types of buffers had a steel rod that carried the buffer plate at one end. The buffer rod would push backwards on a spiral volute spring, or just a coil spring, which was supported by a sheet metal sleeve. The compressing of the spring absorbed the impact, and it was similar to other kinds of spring buffers, but this one in particular was invented by John Belli in 1846. An English mechanical engineer, actually, but he worked in Austria and Germany. Rod buffers aren't seen outside of museum vehicles anymore because there are more modern options that are better. Though, Argentina still has some rolling stock with them, so if you're ever there, you might see some actual coaches with these types of buffers. Other kinds include plunger buffers, which were invented specifically to deal with one of the major flaws of buffer rods, in that they were relatively thin no matter how they made them, and that meant that they had a tendency to, bend and break and cause damage. So Germany, again, developed the plunger buffer. The way these work is that the buffer plate sits on a steel tube with a larger diameter, which was therefore more resistant to bending. The original version of the plunger buffer still had a spring, but the problem with the spring system, especially in this context, is that the spring would eventually snap back, and it snapped back pretty hard, which could be dangerous for all sorts of reasons. or just push the cars apart, which they didn't always want them to do. It required the trains to always be braked very evenly, and was kind of a pain. So, to fix that, they started using ring springs, which don't snap back like volute springs do, as they convert most of the input energy into frictional heat, rather than, just snapping back and releasing it all and throwing things all over the place. And nobody got time for that. But these days, even those are mostly out of favor, as modern buffers generally utilize a pneumatic shock-absorbing system, allowing it to compress and absorb the impact, but also release at a very even and chill rate that doesn't involve any over-engineering, is relatively cost-effective, and relatively safe. Beyond the fact that even in the modern day they can still get stuck together on occasion, buffers are pretty consistent across the board. And it probably helped that over time they were standardized, in order to make sure they were pretty much all the same, no matter what railways they were running on, because, well, inconsistent buffers could cause inconsistencies, and listen, we already talked about Australia and the rail gauges. We don't need conflicting buffer arrangements around here. It's a pain. But naturally, the buffer arrangement does vary quite a bit based on the rail gauge. Generally, the wider the rail is, the wider spaced apart the buffers are. But not always. Some railways choose to keep the buffers at what is effectively the same space apart as it would be on standard gauge, even though the rails are broad gauge. Because it doesn't really matter that much. As long as they're absorbing the impact, it should be fine. At the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is that those buffers meet each other when the cars do. If the buffers don't, that's when you have problems. But if they do, they're fine. And buffers are even included on sidings. Buffer stops are simply dead-end sidings that have buffers attached to them because, well, if they put a train in the siding, they don't want it to just slam into it without something absorbing the impact, assuming they were out of control. Some more elaborate sidings will have hydraulic installations capable of absorbing a lot of energy in case of a serious impact, but those are pretty rare because they're more expensive. At the end of the day, buffers are a pretty recognizable piece of railroading history, in use all over the world, but again with the exception of here. Why not? Why wouldn't we use the buffers? What's wrong with the buffers? Well, to answer the question as to why we won't use the buffers, I will simply answer with NEVER! This is America, you hear me? We don't need no stinking British buffers! You know what we got instead? Jammy couplers. Otherwise known as knuckle couplers. Knuckles. Like a fist, which we use to punch people in the face with freedom! A big, beefy, industrial, full of American precision engineering! Also, they have draft gear built into them. And the draft gear absorbs the impact, just like buffers do. Basically, because we are so happy with knuckle couplers, we don't need buffers, because the couplers themselves are the buffers. They do both. Technically, our couplers are more expensive to make, but they also mean we don't have to have buffers at all, and therefore we don't have the risk of them getting stuck together and jammed up. The semi-automatic nature of knuckle couplers was a lot easier to manage, but over across the pond and in other places, y'all still like your buffers, and hey, I'm not gonna tell you what to do with your railways except on the occasion that I do, but in this situation I'm not gonna do that. Because, there's nothing wrong with buffers. Except the things that are. But they're fine. I mean, they work well for over a century, so, heck, keep having fun with your buffers, and we'll keep having fun with our knuckles. Unlike Sonic, they don't chuckle. We'd rather flex our muscles. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.